Chapter 7. Then Kitty Reed told Patches that it was her soul sickness from too much of nothing at all that had sent her to visit Miss Baldwin that afternoon. She had spoken more in earnest than in jest. More than this, she had gone to the Cross Triangle hoping to meet the stranger of whom she had heard so much. Phil had told Kitty that she would like Patches, and as Phil had put it, the man spoke her language. He could talk to her of people and books and those things of which Williamson Valley folks knew so little. But as she rode slowly homeward after leaving Patches, she found herself of two minds regarding the incident. She had enjoyed meeting the man. He was interested and amusing to her, had taken her out of herself, for she was not the slow to recognize that the man really did belong to that world that was so far away from the world of her childhood. And she was glad for the little adventure that, for one afternoon at least, had broken the dull, weary monotony of her daily life. But the stranger, by the very fact of his belonging to that other world, had stimulated her desire for those things which in her home life and environment she so greatly missed. He had somehow seemed to magnify the almost unbearing commonplace narrowness of her daily routine. He had made her even more restless, disturbed, and dissatisfied. It had been to her as one of those foreign countries meets a citizen from one's old hometown. And for this, Kitty was genuinely sorry. She did not wish to feel as she did about her home and the things that made the world of those she loved. She had tried honestly to still the unrest and to deny the longing. She had wished many times, since her return from the East, that she had never left her home for those 3 years in school. And yet, those years had meant much to her. They had been wonderful years, but they seemed somehow, now that they were past and she was home again, to have brought her only unrest and longing. From the beginning of her years until the first great crisis in her life, she was going away to school. This world into which she was born had been to Kitty an all-sufficient world. The days of her childhood had been carefree and joyous almost as the days of the young things of her father's roaming herds. As her girlhood years advanced, under her mother's wise companionship and careful teaching, she had grown into her share of the household duties and into a knowledge of a woman's part in life to which she belonged as naturally as her girlish form had put on the graces of a young woman. The things that filled the days of her father and mother and the days of her neighbors and friends had filled her days as well. The things that were all in all to those she loved had been all in all to her. And always, through those years from her earliest childhood to her young womanhood, there had been Phil, her playmate, schoolmate, protector, hero, slave. That Phil had been her boy sweetheart and young man lover had seemed as natural to Kitty as her relations to her parents. There had never been anyone else but Phil. There never could be, she was sure, in those days, anyone else. In Kitty's heart that afternoon as she rode, so indifferent to the life that called from every bush and tree and grassy hill and distant mountain, there was a sweet regret, deep and sincere, for those years that were now, to her, irrevocably gone. Kitty did not know how impossible it was for her to ever wholly escape the things that belonged to her childhood and youth. Those things of her girlhood, out of which her heart and soul had been fashioned, were as interwoven in the fabric of her being as the vitality, strength, and purity of the clean, wholesome outdoor life of those same years were wrought into the glowing health and vigor and beauty of her physical woman. And then had come those other years, the maturing and ripening years when, from the simple, primitive, and enduring elements of life, she had gone to live amid complex and cultivated and largely fanciful standards and values. In that land of Kitty's birth, a man was measured by the measure of his manhood. A woman is ranked by the quality of her womanhood. Strength and courage, sincerity, honesty, and usefulness. These were prime essentials of the man's life that Kitty had, in those years of her girlhood known, and these too, in their feminine expressions, were the essentials of the woman's life. But from these the young woman had gone to the educated in a world where other things were first importance. She had gone to be taught that these were not the essential elements of womanhood or manhood. Or, at least, if she was not to be deliberately so taught, these things would be so ignored and neglected and overlooked in her training that the effect of her character would be the same. In that new world, she was to learn that men and women are not to be measured by the standards of womanhood or manhood, that they were to be rated, not for strength, but by culture, not for courage, but intellectual cleverness, and not for sincerity, but for manners, not for honesty, but for success, and not for usefulness, but social position, which is most often determined by the degree of uselessness. It was as though the handler of gems were to attract no value whatever to the weight of the diamond itself, but to fix the world of the stone wholly by the cutting and polishing that the crystal might receive. At first, Kitty had been excited, bewildered, and fascinated by the glittering and sparkling and ever-changing, many-faceted life. And then she grew weary and homesick. And then as the months passed, she had been drawn more and more by association and environment into the world of down-to-datism. She, too, began to regard the sparkle of the diamond as the determining factor in the value of the gem. And when the young woman had achieved this, they called her educated finished, and sent her back to the land over which Granite Mountain, gray, grim, and fortress-like, with its ranks of sentinel hills, kept enduring and an unchanging watch. During those first glad days of Kitty's homecoming, she had been eagerly interested in everything. The trivial bits of news about the small doings of her old friends had been delightful. The home life, with its simple routine and sweet companionship, had been restful and satisfying. The very scenes of her girlhood had seemed to welcome her with a spirit of genuineness and steadfastness that had made her feel as one entering a safe home harbor after a long adventurous voyage to a far-away and little-known land. And Phil, in the virile strength of his manhood, in the simple bigness of his character, in his enduring and unchanging love, had made her feel his likeness to the primitive land of his birth. But when the glad excitement of those first days of her return were past, when the meetings with old friends were over, and the tales of their doings were exhausted, then Kitty began to realize what her education, as they called it, really meant. The lessons of those 3 years were not to be erased from her life as one would erase a mistake in a problem or a misspelled word. The tastes, habits of thought, and standards of life, the acquirement of which constituted her culture, would not be denied. It was inevitable that there should be a clash between the claims of her home life and the claims of that life to which she now felt that she also belonged. However odious comparisons may be, they are many times inevitable. Loyalty, Kitty tried to magnify the worth of those things that in her girlhood had been the supreme things in her life, but try as she might, they were now, in comparison with those things which her culture placed first, of trivial importance. The virile strength and glowing health of Phil's unspoiled manhood, beautiful in the rigorous life of one of the wild horses from which he had been nicknamed, was overshadowed now by the young man's inability to clothe his splendid body in that fashion which her culture demanded. His simple and primitive views of life, as natural as the instincts which governs all creatures in his God-cultivated world, were now unrefined, ignoble, and inelegant. His fine nature and unembarrassed intelligence, which found in the wealth of realities amid which he lived abundant food for his intellectual life, and which enabled him to see clearly, observe closely, and think with such clear-cut directness, beside the intellectuality of those schooled in the thoughts of others, appeared as ignorant and illiterate. The very fineness and gentleness of his nature were now the distinguishing marks of an uncouth and awkward rustic. With all her woman heart, Kitty had fought against those comparisons and continued to make them. Everything in her nature that belonged to Granite Mountain, that was, in short, the product of that land, answered to Phil's call, as instinctively as the life that land calls and answers its mating calls. Everything that she had acquired in those 3 years of more advanced civilization denied and repulsed him. And now her meeting with Patches had stirred the warring forces to renewed activity, and in the directing turmoil of her thoughts she found herself hating the land she loved, loathing the life that appealed to her with such instinctive power, despising those who she so clearly esteemed and honored, and denying the affection of which she was proud with a true woman's tender pride. Kitty was aroused from her absorption by the thrilled, boyish yells of her 2 younger brothers, who, catching sight of their sister from the top of one of the low hills that edged the meadow bottom lands, were charging recklessly down upon her. All the clatter and rumble of those 8 flying hoofs drew closer and closer. Midnight, too, came alive, as the cowboys say, and tossed his head and pranced with eager impatience. "Where in the world you been around all afternoon?" demanded Jimmy, with his 12-year-old authority, as his pony skidded to a halt within a foot or 2 of his sister's horse. And, "We wanted you to go with us to see our coyote traps," reproved Connie, who was 2 years younger than his brother, as his pinto executed a like manner on the other side of the excited Midnight. "And where's Jack?" asked the young woman mischievously, as she smiled, welcoming the vigorous lads. "Couldn't he help?" Jack was the other member of the Reed trio of boys, a lusty 4-year-old who felt himself equal to any venture that intrigued his brothers. Jimmy grinned. "Aw, Mum coaxed him into the kitchen with something to eat while me and Connie sneaked down to the corral and saddled up and beat it." Big Sister's dark eyebrows arched in shocked inquiry. "Me and Connie?" "That's Connie and I," amended Jimmy, with good-natured tolerance of his sister's whims. "You see, Kitty," put in Connie, "this here coyote trapping ain't just fun, it's business. Dad promised us $3 for every scalp, and we're aiming to make us a stake. Although we didn't get a blasted thing today." Sister's painful and despairing expression was blissfully ignored as Jimmy stealthily flicked the long rumple at the end of his bridle reins against Midnight's flank. "Gee," observed the tickled youngster as Kitty gave all her attention to restraining the fretting and indignated horse. "Old Midnight is a little feisty, ain't he?" "I'll race you both to the big gate," challenged Kitty. "For how much?" demanded Jimmy quickly. "You gotta give us a 50 yards head start, though," declared Connie, leaning forward in the saddle and shortening his range. "If I win, you boys go straight to bed tonight when it's time without no fussing. And I'll give you that oak brush over there yonder as a head start," gave Kitty. "Good enough, you're on," they shouted in chorus and loped away. As they passed the handicap mark, another shrill, defiant yell came floating back to where Kitty was sitting, reining on her impatient Midnight. At the signal, the 2 ponies leapt from a lope into a full run, while Kitty loosened the restraining reins, and the black horse stretched away in pursuit. Spurring, shouting, entreating, the 2 lads urged their sturdy mounts towards the goal, and the pinto answered gamely with all they had. Over knoll and washes, across canyon and gully they flew, sure-footed and eager, neck and neck, well behind them. Drawing closer and closer came the black, with body low, head outstretched, and limbs that moved apparently with the timed regularity and driving power of a locomotive piston rod. As she passed them, Kitty shouted out, "Come on!" when they answered with redoubled exertion another yell of hearty, boyish admiration for the victorious Midnight and his beautiful rider. "Doggone that black streak!" exclaimed Jimmy, his eyes dancing with fun as they pulled up at the corral gate. "He opens and shuts like a blamed old jackrabbit," commented Connie. "Seems like we was just sitting still watching you go by." Kitty laughed, tensely, unconsciously slipping into the vernacular as she returned, "Did you kids think you were a horseback?" "Oh, you just wait, miss," retorted the grinning Jimmy as he opened the big gate. "I'll get a horse some day that'll ride circles around that old black scoundrel." And then, as they dismounted at the door of the saddle room at the big barn, he added generously, "You scoot on into the house, Kitty. I'll take care of Midnight. It must be getting close to supper time, and I'm hungry enough to eat a raw dog." At which alarming statement, Kitty promptly scooted and stopped only long enough at the windmill pump for a cool, refreshing drink. Miss Reed, with sturdy little Jack helping, was already busy in the kitchen. She was a motherly woman, rather below Kitty's height and inclined somewhat to a comfortable stoutness. In her face was the gentle strength and patience of those whose years had been spent in homemaking, without the hardness that sometimes is seen in the faces of those whose love is not great enough to soften their toil. One knew by the light in her eyes whenever she spoke to Kitty, or, indeed, whenever the girl's name was mentioned, how large a place her only daughter held in her mother's heart. While the two worked together at their homely task, the girl related in trivial detail the news of the neighborhood and repeated faithfully the talk she had had with the mistress of Cross Triangle, answering all her mother's questions, replying with careful interest to the older woman's comments, relating all that was known or guessed, and observing regarding the stranger. But of her meeting with Patches, Kitty said little, only that she had met him as she was coming home. All during the evening meal, too, Patches was the principal topic of conversation, though Mr. Reed, who had arrived home just in time for supper, had said little about. When supper was over, the evening work was finished, Kitty sat on the porch in the twilight, looking away across the wide valley meadows toward the light that shone where the walnut trees about the Cross Triangle ranch house made a darker mass in the gathering gloom. Her father had gone to call upon the dean. The men were at the bunkhouse, from which their voices came low and indistinct. Within the house, the mother was coaxing little Jack to bed. Jimmy and Connie, on the farthest end of the porch, were planning an extensive campaign against coyotes and investing the unearned profits of their proposed industry. Kitty's thoughts were many miles away. In that bright, stirring life, so far from the gloomy stillness of her homeland, where she sat so alone, what gay pleasures held her friends? Amid what brilliant scenes were they spending the evening, while she sat in her dark and silent world alone? As her memories painted the pictures, the stirring movements, the music, the merry-voiced talk, the laughter, the gaiety, the excitement, the companionship of those whose life was so full of interest, her heart rebelled at the dull emptiness of her days. As she watched the gathering evening that was deepening as the darkness of night came on, and the outlines of the familiar landscape faded and vanished in the thickening gloom, she felt the dreary monotony of the days and years that were to come, blotting out her life, all tone and color and forms of brightness and beauty. Then she saw, slowly emerging from the shadows of the meadow below, a darker shadow, mysterious and formless, that seemed as if approaching to shape itself out of the very darkness through which it came, until, still dim and indistinct, a horseman was opening the meadow gate. Before the cowboy answered Jimmy's boyish hello, Kitty knew that it was Phil. The young woman's first impulse was to retreat into the safe seclusion of her own room. But even as she arose to her feet, she knew how that would hurt the man who had always been so good to her. And so she went generously down the walk to meet him, where he had dismounted and would leave his horse. "Did you see father?" she asked, thinking as she spoke how little there was for them to talk about. "Why, no. What's the matter?" he returned quickly, as if ready to ride again at her word. She laughed a little at his manner. "Oh, there's nothing the matter. He just went over to see the Dean, that's all." "I must have missed him crossing the meadow," he returned. "He always goes around by the road, I suppose." And then when he stood beside her, he added gently, "But there is something the matter, Kitty. What is it? Are you lonesome for the bright lights?" That was always Phil's way, she thought. He seemed to always know instinctively her every mood and wish. "Perhaps I'm a little lonely," she admitted. "I'm glad you came." Then they were at the porch, and her ambitious brothers were telling Phil in detail their all-absorbed designs against the peace of the coyote tribe, and asking his advice. Miss Reed came to sit with them a while, and again the talk followed around the narrow circle of their lives, until Kitty felt she could bear no more. Then Miss Reed, more merciful than she knew, sent the boys to bed, and then retired to her own room. "And so you're tired of us all and want to go back," mused Phil, breaking one of the long silent periods that in those days seemed so often to fall upon them when they found themselves alone. That's not quite fair, Phil," she returned gently. "You know it's not that." "Well, then I guess I'm tired of this." His gesture indicated the sweep of the wide land. "Tired of what we are and what we do?" The girl stirred uneasily but didn't speak. "I don't blame you," he continued as if speaking aloud. "It must have been pretty empty to those who really don't know." "And don't I know it?" challenged Kitty. "You seem to forget that I was born here, that I lived here almost as many years as you." "But just the same, you don't know," returned Phil gently. "You see, dear, you knew it as a girl, the same as I did when I was a boy. And now, well, I know it as a man, and you as a woman know something that you think is very different." Again the long silence lay a barrier between them, and then Kitty made the effort, hesitatingly. "Do you love the life so very, very much, Phil?" He answered quickly. "Yes, but I could love any life that suits you." No, she returned hurriedly. "That's not... I mean, Phil, why are you satisfied here? It seems like there's so little for a man such as you." "So little?" His voice told her that her words had stung. "I told you that you don't know. Why, everything that a man has a right to want is right here. All that life can give anywhere is here. I mean, all of life that's worth having. But I suppose that it's hard for you to see it that way now. It's like trying to make a city man understand why a fellow's never lonesome when just because there's no crowd around. I guess I love this life, and I'm satisfied with it just as the wild horses over there at the foot of old Granite love it and are satisfied." "Don't you feel sometimes that if you had greater opportunities, don't you sometimes wish that you could live where—" She paused with a loss of words. Phil somehow always made the things she craved seem so trivial. "I know what you mean," he answered. "You mean, don't the wild horses wish that they could live in a fine stable, and have a lot of men to feed and care for them, and rig them with fancy gold-mounted harnesses, and let them prance down the street for crowds to see? No, horses have more sense than that. It takes a human to make that kind of fool of himself. There's only one thing in the world that would make me want to try it, and I guess you know what that is." His last words robbed his answer of its sting, and she said gently, You're bitter tonight, Phil. It's not like you." He didn't answer. "Did something go wrong today?" she persisted. He turned suddenly to face her and spoke with a passion that was unusual to him. "I saw you at the ranch this afternoon as you were riding away. You didn't even turn to look towards the corral where you knew I was at work, and it seemed like all the heart went clear out of me. Kitty, can't we bring back the old days as they were before you went away?" "Oh, hush, Phil," she said, almost as if she would have spoken to one of her boy brothers, but he went on recklessly. "No, I'm going to speak tonight. Ever since you came home, you've refused to listen to me. You've put me off and made me keep still. I want to tell you, Kitty, if I was like Honorable Patches, would it make any difference?" "I don't know, Mr. Patches," she answered. "You met him today, and you know what I mean. Would it make any difference if I was more like him?" "Phil, dear, how can I answer such a question? I don't know." "Then it's not because I live here in this country instead of back east in some city that's made you change?" "I have changed, I suppose, because I've become a woman, Phil, just as you've become a man." "Yes, I have become a man, but I've not changed except that the boy's love has become a man's love. Would it make any difference, Kitty, if you cared more for the life here? I mean, if you were content here, if these things that mean so much to all of us satisfied you?" Again she answered, "I don't know, Phil. How could I know?" "Will you try, Kitty? I mean, try to like your old home as you used to like it?" "Phil, I have tried, I do," she cried, "but I don't think it's the life that I like or do not like that makes the difference. I'm sure, Phil, that if I could—" She hesitated, then went on bravely, "If I could give you the love you want, nothing else would matter. You said you could like any life that suited me. Don't you think that I could be satisfied with any life that the man I love suited?" "Yes, you could, and I guess that's the answer." "What's the answer?" she asked. "Love. Just love, Kitty. Any place with love is a good place, and without love no life can satisfy." "I'm glad you said that. It was what I was wanting you to say. I know now what I have to do. I am like Patches. I have found my job." There was no bitterness in his voice now. The girl was deeply moved. "But I don't think I quite understand, Phil," she said. "Why, don't you see?" he returned. "My job is to win your love and to make you love me for myself, for just what I am as a man, not try to be something or to live some way that I think you'd like. It's the man that you must love, not what he does or where he lives. Isn't that it?" "Yes," she answered slowly. "I'm sure that is so. It has to be so, Phil." He rose to his feet abruptly. "All right," he said roughly. "I'll be going now. But don't make any mistake, Kitty. You're mine. Mine by laws that are higher than the things that they teach you at school. And you're going to find it out. I'm going to win you just as the wild things out there win their mates. You're going to come to me, girl, because you're mine and because you're my mate." And then, as she too arose and they stood for a silent moment facing each other, the woman felt his strength, and in her heart it beat glad and proud, though she could not give all that he asked. As she watched him ride away into the night, the soft mystery of the darkness out of which he had come seemed to take his shadowy form again to itself. She wondered with regret in the thought, would he perhaps go thus out of her life? Would he? When Phil turned his horse in the meadow pasture at home, the big bay, from somewhere in the darkness, trumpeted his challenge. A low laugh came from nearby, and in the lights of the stars Phil saw a man standing by the pasture fence. As he went towards the shadowy figure, the voice of Patches followed the laugh. "I'll bet that was stranger." "I know it was," answered Phil. "What's the matter that you're not in bed?" "I was just listening to the horses out here and thinking," returned Patches. "Thinking about your job?" asked Phil quietly. "Perhaps," admitted the other. "Well, you've no reason to worry. You'll ride 'em all right," said the cowboy. "I wish I could be just as sure," the other returned doubtfully. They both knew they were using the big bay horse as a symbol. "And I wish I was sure of making good at my job as I am that you'll win out with yours," returned Phil. Patch's voice was very kind as he said reflectively, "So, you have a job too. I'm glad for that." "Glad?" "Yes." The tall man placed a hand on the other's shoulders as they turned to walk towards the house. "Because, Phil, I have come to the conclusion that this old world is a mighty empty place for the man who has nothing to do." "But there seems to be a lot of fellows who manage to keep fairly busy doing nothing just the same, don't you think?" replied Phil with a low laugh. "I said man," retorted Patches with emphasis. "That's right," agreed Phil. "A man just naturally requires a man's job." "And," mused Patches, "when it's all said and done, I suppose there's only one genuine Simon Pure full-sized man job in the world." "I reckon that's right too," returned the cowboy. End of chapter 7.